Alright, here we're going to begin with a general classification of cells. Now, cell is the basic unit of life. Uh, Everything living is made of cells. Now, there can be things that can invade cells like viruses. Viruses are not considered living. You have to have cells to be living. Now, in general, you look at cells, you look at them under the microscope, and we've been looking at them for decades under microscopes. Actually, several hundred years. They just didn't know what they were necessarily, but we've known about them for quite a while, and we look at them, and of course, we've classified them. We've said, hey, some of these look similar, and they do similar things, others look different. But all living things are made of cells, and here we have the eukaryote and the prokaryote. Now, this is the easiest, and this is the traditional method of classification. So 20 years ago, you would take this course, and they would have said, the broadest type of classification is basically the cell type. You're either a eukaryote or a prokaryote. In other words, your cells look like this, or they look like this. Eukaryotes have a very complex cell structure that we're going to talk a lot about. And prokaryotes have a very simple cell structure with not very many parts, and they're usually single-celled. Actually, they were always single-celled. So a prokaryote is a single-celled organism, and a eukaryote can be a single-celled organism. These are usually. There are single-celled eukaryotes, but what eukaryotes all have is they have a nucleus. They have basically these regions that are compartments inside of the cell that have special functions. Just like you have organs inside your body that do special things, like your stomach does something, your heart does something. Everything, you have little structures in there that do things. Well, eukaryotes also have little structures in here that do things. The prokaryotes, as a general rule, do not. We will talk about the differences between here later on. But the nucleus. The nucleus is where you keep your DNA safe. All right, mitochondria, considered the powerhouse of the cell, which we will talk about. Basically, the idea here is this is a complex, larger structure. These, by the way, the eukaryotic cell can be as much as 10,000 times the size of a prokaryote. So this thing can be this little tiny thing swimming around it, you might think of. So bacteria, prokaryotes, prokaryotes tend to be, you think of them as bacteria. Eukaryotes, you think of larger organisms, multicellular organisms that have many cells. Bacteria are single cells. They're all individuals. All right. Our cells all belong to, like, our bodies, and they collectively work together to make an organism. Here you have a single-celled organism over here. These are typically the bacteria. These are typically larger creatures that are multicellular. It doesn't mean that there are not single-celled eukaryotes. Things like algae and some things like that can be eukaryotes. But as a general rule, they can live in communities, but as a general rule, they are multicellular. But there are single-celled eukaryotes that live just fine by themselves. All right, now this is the classical way of classifying these organisms. But of course, when we learned to sequence DNA, we learned some very interesting things, and we realized that, oh, maybe this isn't the best way to begin the classification. The DNA says something completely different. So let me show you the new way of starting the classification process, the one based on DNA instead of just this morphology or anatomy or even processes. These do things differently. We instead now look at the DNA, and we have three groups. We have the eukarya, which are the eukaryotes, the bacteria, and the archaea. So what are the archaea? And didn't I just say that all the bacteria were prokaryotes? Well, what we have here, these are two different types of prokaryotes. We now consider bacteria and archaea to be the prokaryotes. That's kind of what they look like. All right? The eukaryotes really haven't changed from the old classification. But what we did was we took this group and we broke it up into two other groups. We now have bacteria and we have archaea, and go, well, okay, what's the big deal? Well, the thing is, the archaea are much more closely related to eukaryotes genetically than they are to bacteria. Archaea may have been the first organisms. Now, they look like bacteria, but when you look at certain pieces of their DNA, the oldest pieces, they're like the eukaryotes. It's very interesting. And because of this, we have decided that it's better to break organisms up into domains, the highest level of organization, that we start breaking things up into different groups, into bacteria, which look almost identical to archaea, and then the eukaryotes, which I've explained, the multicellular organisms, or at least the ones that have organelles. All right, organelles are the structures inside the cells. Those are the eukarya. The archaea and the bacteria are the prokaryotes. So these are prokaryotes, these are the eukaryotes, okay? So understand that this is our first level of classification, and this is the new way of looking at it. And the reason we broke these into two from the prokaryotes is that their DNA is just too different from one another for us to count them as being in the same group. The archaea, if you didn't know, these are extremophiles. They look like bacteria, but they live in really weird places. They live in the upper atmosphere where there's almost no oxygen, or they might live under the water in underwater lakes in Antarctica, where the water itself, because of the pressure, is liquid, but it's because of the pressure, it might be minus 30 degrees, minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit, but it's still liquid, and there are something that look like bacteria living there. We've decided that these are not bacteria. These are archaea. They look like bacteria, but they are really different. These things live at the bottom of the ocean. They live near volcanic vents, little mini volcanoes you might think of that at the bottom of the ocean, and they live near that, picking up things falling from above and picking up heat and light from the volcanic vents and even chemicals. Very interesting creatures. There are no diseases caused by archaea. Bacteria, yes, bacteria can act as a pathogen. Archaea, there are no known archaea pathogens in humans or actually in any other eukaryotic multicellular organism. So realize that these guys are really weird. They have way different DNA than the bacteria, but they are still considered prokaryotes because of what they look like. But as far as our classification goes this way, and so the classification has broken from the standard way of classifying by what it looks like. We have now begun to classify by the DNA and looking at how different the DNA is now, instead of looking at just what they look like. All right, now we move on. We're looking at cells here. This is your standard bacteria, and here are a lot of parts that you hopefully looked at in Bio 1. All right, here is your typical animal cell, and here is your typical plant cell. So the next classification level below the eukaryote are that you have plants and animals. So both of these types here, the plant cells and the animal cells, are eukaryotic, but the animal cells, of course, have a much different looking cell. So we've classified here at this point plants and animals. That's your next level of classification under eukaryotes. The differences are there are more parts in the plant cell. The plant cell is actually more complicated. It has a cell wall, this kind of rigid structure around it. All right, it also has chloroplasts, and it has more of these vacuoles for storing things. Plant cells are actually much more complicated than animal cells. We have more different categories of animal cells. When you have a multicellular organism, you'll have different cell types like skin cells and liver cells and neurons. So you'll have a lot more different types in an animal, but the individual cells themselves in a plant are far more complicated. And there are reasons for this, and we will talk about it. All right, so here's an animal cell blown up, and here are all the parts. We won't have time to test you on all the parts, but we will talk about a few of them, and you'll need to know some general ones like the nucleus and the mitochondria, that sort of thing. You need to know that they're a membrane, and you need to know that these are membrane-bound organelles. Organelles are the little organs. The nucleus is an organelle. It involves a membrane. Mitochondria have a double membrane. These other organelles, these other parts like lysosomes, these are organelles and they are membrane-bound. Now, for me, some books and some instructors will say ribosomes are organelles. I classify them as something else, which we'll get to in the future. But only the membrane-bound ones are we going to call organelles in this class. So the peroxisome is an organelle, the lysosome, the nucleus, the mitochondria. Those are all organelles because they're made out of membrane. They are compartments within the cell. All right, now we move on. We have the plant cell. Now, over here we have a membrane on the outside of the cell. Well, there is a membrane on the outside of the cell here, but on the outside of that is a more rigid wall. That's the plant cell's cell wall. All right, then you have the cell membrane. The other addition are the mitochondria, and then you have these large storage vacuoles that you tend to not have in animal cells because plants need to store stuff. Plants cannot get up and move around like an animal. Animal, it gets too hot or you run out of water, you start walking around looking for it. Plants just have to stay there and deal with it and hopefully hope it rains. So, or food comes along or something, or the sun comes up. So plant cells tend to have large storage regions in their cells to store things up until conditions change. All right, now this is what you might see under a microscope. These are just cells all next to each other, crammed. I'm not sure what type of cells these are. One thing that people are not aware of in general, it's not necessarily true here. I'm not sure what kind of tissue this is. I just saw it and as a picture and thought it said, okay, here are some actual cells. The point here is to show that cells don't actually look like this or this. You have many different types of cells and none of them end up looking like that. And plant cells, maybe they do sort of look like that, but animal cells, there is no cell that looks like this. You end up with stuff like this. But there's also regions in between cells. That's the extracellular matrix. And actually, the most of your body is made out of extracellular matrix, not cells. The cells are just kind of stuck in the matrix. The matrix is kind of like Jell-O. And if your grandmother ever made put fruit in the Jell-O, you can think of the fruit as the cells. All right, they're different shapes. There are a lot of them, and they're just kind of floating there in the Jell-O. And then the actual Jell-O would be what's called the extracellular matrix. And when you touch an organ like the liver, the brain, or something, you're actually touching the matrix, the Jell-O part. You're typically not touching the cells. Now, on the outside of your body, you have skin, yes, they're connected right next to each other, kind of like this tissue. Maybe this is some type of external crusty material on some organism. I don't know what this is. But yeah, those cells are right next to each other, like skin, especially things on the outside. But internal organs, you're going to have a lot more matrix, and the cells are going to be really kind of scarce, and the majority of the organ is actually the matrix. All right, now cells begin from stem cells. Stem cells are cells that haven't decided what they want to be yet. They're early in development, though you do have some stem cells. Not many, and you get fewer and fewer as you age, but even a 90-year-old person will have some stem cells left. They can extract stem cells. But these are cells that, over time, have not decided that I want to be a fat cell, or I want to be a muscle cell, I want to be an immune cell. You can see that these all look so different. And cells, at some point, they do kind of start out. Maybe they got those pictures from early stem cells. But over time, these cells decide that they're going to do some type of particular function. Usually this is when you're developing in the womb, and a stem cell will decide to be an immune system cell, or a sperm or an egg here, or a muscle cell, or a fat cell, or a bone cell. And they will begin producing different proteins. They will turn genes on and off at different times in life, and we'll learn how that process works. And when they turn genes on and off, they produce different proteins, and different proteins will cause the cells to change their look, their shape, their physiological processes, how they operate, what they do. And it's basically this idea that a cell doesn't use all of its genes. It only uses a subset of them to produce a subset of potential proteins that are in the cell that actually make a cell do what it does. So it's the turning on and off of genes, and it's very key to understand this to understand how a multicellular organism works. A bacteria, all right, much smaller, doesn't have much DNA. It doesn't have this problem. All of its genes are pretty much on all the time, whereas over here, only a subset of the genes are on. And I'm going to emphasize that in this class. I'm going to emphasize that you start with stem cells, and then over time they decide to become one of these specialized cells.